please keep your cameras off. We also ask that you mute yourselves at this time. My name is Jasmine Shoemaker, and I, along with my colleagues Emily Cullen, Susan Graham, and Semhar Yohannes, run the Spotlight Guest Instructor Workshop Series. In this series, we invite university community members and friends to share their research and creative endeavors in one-hour talks, hosted in the library or virtually. Due to the ongoing success of the Spotlight series, we have expanded the parameters to create a semester-long themed symposium every fall semester. This fall semester-long symposium, titled Prison State, aims to explore the regional and pervasive impact of prison incarceration in Maryland and the current debate around prison abolition. The inspiration for this theme comes from the library special collection's prison-related materials. Today, we welcome our sixth speaker of the symposium, Lawrence Grandpre. Lawrence is the Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. His focus includes drug policy, criminal justice, police accountability, and community-based economic educational development. He is the co-author of The Black Book, and his work has been featured in The Guardian, The Baltimore Sun, Time Magazine, and Black Agenda Report. He is also the co-host of the In Search of Black Power podcast. His presentation today is titled Drug Decriminalization from a Reparations Perspective. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Hi, can you hear me? The mic's coming through okay? Okay, great. Well, I'm going to get right to it. My name is Lawrence. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. I work for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're a grassroots think tank. We go by our initials LBS, many of the people in our organization. We got our start in political analysis through policy debate. This is a rigorous two-person academic competition. It's one topic for the whole country. And you basically travel the entire country, usually elite schools. It's expensive to travel, doing this analysis of policy. And there was this revolution in the community where Black elders basically brought Black students along to challenge the political conversation in this elite enclave of discourse, basically bring critical race theory, Black feminism, and other forms of political analysis that reflected Black students' lived experience into this community. And we were part of this movement. We're very successful in doing it. Our Director of Public Policy, Dave Von Love, is one half of the first two-person team of Black students to win a college debate national championship. For the first 40 years of policy debate, there was one Black national champion. I think from 2008 to like 2016, there were, I believe, 6 national champions, 4 Black and 4 were from Baltimore. So this is an example of the indigenous genius of Black Baltimoreans that we seek to bring into the policy experience, because we realized our opponents in debate were literally going on to work in DC think tanks that wrote policy for the entire world, and no one was doing anything similar for working class Black folk. So since 2010, we've been in the community. Some of our successes include helping to be part of a movement coalition to stop the construction of a $100 million proposed youth jail in Baltimore. We were some of the folks leading the policy response to police brutality. Before Freddie Gray's unfortunate death and after his death, we were part of the folks leading protests and also pushing on police accountability issues all the way up till this past session, 2021, where we actually got to repeal of Maryland's Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, a very important piece of legislation that precludes police accountability in many ways. We also work in the Baltimore State Children and Youth Fund, giving resources to grassroots organizations. And so we're not a nonprofit. We made a very intentional decision to not be a nonprofit based upon the work of consulting with our elders, who basically told us that the narrative of the 50s, the 60s and 70s was that was political repression that hurt the movements for radical liberation in America. But the flip side that we were told was that was also the incorporation of a lot of that radical energy into institutional nonprofits where well-meaning people were basically forced to be less radical and political. Like, you literally can't support elected officials if you work for a nonprofit, or nonprofits themselves can't do electoral politics. But also just generally the focus, where you spend your time, you have to make payroll, you have to keep getting grants, you have to keep getting funded to feed people on your payroll. And that trades off with more grassroots radical political interventions. So we made an intentional effort to not be a nonprofit. So one of the things that we do is that we only advocate for policies that we want to advocate for. So foundations, they really, unless we're already advocating for it, we don't hop on the advocacy campaign because we get a grant to do it. So what we do is we consult, I do research, other people do advocacy and consulting on a bunch of different things. So one of the things I've been consulting on for a few years now is a research project from the University of Maryland School of Social Work on decriminalization drugs from a grassroots perspective, from reparations perspective. And the idea is that drug policy for a long time has been trapped in essentially this libertarian framework, this individual liberty framework, and it doesn't account for the larger social dynamics that impact how the war on drugs actually manifests itself. So one scholar who I use in this work is Todd Clear, formerly from Rutgers. He has a book called Imprisoning Community, where he basically makes the argument, he calls it coercive mobility, but it's basically something that's pretty intuitive, is that we don't really have mass incarceration in America. We have targeted incarceration for poor Black and brown people. These poor Black and brown people are targeted in specific neighborhoods, zip codes, and that the cumulative impact of cycling so many, especially Black and brown men, in and out of jail in these zip codes doesn't just hurt those people who go to jail. It hurts the ability of civil society in those communities to flourish, so much so that the more people you incarcerate, the more damage done to civil society, the less alternative there is to the drug game or the underground economy, and you're actually creating more crime than you're preventing by doing mass incarceration. You're shredding the civic fabric of these communities, not just locking individual people in jail. And so I think Clear's work here is demonstrative, but I do think sometimes he falls into a somewhat deficit-based Eurocentric way of talking about these dynamics. He talks about things like social cohesion. And that social cohesion is shredded when you somewhat capriciously lock young Black men up in ways that are racially disproportionate. But I think that one thing we wanted to do was use qualitative research, interviews, to be able to supplement some of the academic research. And I'm going to do both in today's talk. With the time I have, is give you some quotes from people that we've interviewed anonymously for this research project, and also give you some academic knowledge to explain my perspective on how we can think about decriminalization from reparations perspective. So the first quote is from 20-something, a Black male, talking about the dynamics of policing around drugs in Baltimore City. And here's the quote. I remember we were in the 90s and early 2000s, and the gun trace task force, all that stuff got locked up for. I remember in Sandtown, the boys were talking about police being another gang because they'd jump our boys. In an unmarked car, they come into the community, the neighborhood, and jump out and start knocking people around and pushing people around and accusing them of things. And the children experience this. How could they go to the police for anything when the police cannot be trusted? And they knew the police were busting people and taking their drugs and not reporting. You know, the kid, the corner boy, would have to give up his stash and the police would leave him alone. Well, what is that kind of thing? So we're here talking to these kids and talking to them to do the right thing and obey the law and all that. And they say, well, look at the people who are doing the law, the contradiction there. It's really amazing. So this is a quote about the gun trace task force, and I can attest to you hearing this discourse in 2015. These well known now because of the HBO series, but they weren't just, they were stealing drugs and selling them. And this idea of the police themselves being the drug dealers was largely dismissed, almost as a conspiracy theory by many people in power. So I think this is important for a couple of reasons. First, merely decriminalizing drugs doesn't address the dynamic of racial violence that policing reflects. So yes, they use drugs as the excuse, but understanding these structural dynamics of policing, these interviewees gave us an understanding that it's racialized social control that produced the criminalization of drugs. You can't just get rid of racialized social control by decriminalizing drugs. Similarly, to speak to Todd Clear, one of the things that I've been adamant about is that some of the things that Eurocentric white liberal academics frame from a deficit standpoint should actually be seen from perspective of positivity and cultivating. So if you're seeing these sort of dynamics, which being in Sandtown doing work, we've literally seen cops act like gangs, you're going to develop an oppositional, defiant personality to power. And there's a dominant perspective in drug treatment, in liberal political theory and academic theory, to say, how do we calm people down? How do we create social cohesion? How do we change social networks and get more social capital, folks tied into dominant systems? And there's also a dominant strain in our interviews that says, no, it's a perfectly legitimate and important response to oppression to say this is wrong, and I have to do something about it. So as opposed to just focusing on social cohesion, how do we cultivate this righteous indignation towards effective political tools? And one thing we're realizing is that dominant theories of decriminalization that just focus on investing in community programs don't actually have a theory for that. And some of these community programs actually are doing the opposite. they're also pushing that social cohesion, calm down, meditate, go along to get along narrative. That's the opposite of what many people in our research section actually advocated for. But I want to talk a little bit about what the war on drugs is doing in more detail. So, because it's important to understand the war on drugs from the perspective of how it's actually functioning in our communities. That's the only way we can understand the type of reparations that would actually fix the problem. So Michael Mueller-Smith from the University of Michigan writes the report, The Criminal and Labor Market Impact of Incarceration. And this is just a tiny, tiny quote. I'll explain more afterwards. But this paper investigates the impact of incarceration on criminal behavior. The empirical results indicate that incarceration generates net increases in the frequency and severity of recidivism, worsens labor market outcomes, and strengthens dependency on public assistance. He continues. Short-run gains through things like deterrence are more than offset by long-term increases in post-release criminal behavior. Incarceration encourages more serious offenses and promotes new types of criminal behavior, especially property and drug-related offenses post-release. So what does that mean? I think, again, this is important because we have to understand the mechanism of harm to understand the mechanism of redress that's needed. So when you're doing mass incarceration, you're increasing criminality in these communities. It's important to understand why. So not all crime is like mafia organized crime, but most of it comes out of social cliques and networks where maybe you're just selling a little weed. And if someone gets locked up for, intent to distribute, what you've basically done is create a job opening in the underground economy. People self-medicate with cannabis. They self-medicate with fentanyl even. So pain, psychological distress, that need doesn't go away because you lock somebody up. So when you lock somebody up in the criminal economy, you've just created a job opening. So think of it as a conveyor belt where people from the community who might be adjacent to criminal behavior might hang out with people who are quote unquote in gangs, which are really just social cliques. But not really in the game. They basically get drafted to meet the need, the job opening in the criminal economy. So by taking one person in jail, many times you're bringing another person who is not really criminally involved, but just in the community into the underground economy. Just like anything else, supply and demand. But there's another dynamic to it where there's another conveyor belt in the prison, where a lot of these folks, they may sell some weed on the side, they may sell some pills on the side, but they may also be trying to do legitimate work. They may do some subcontracting, maybe fix roofs or fix pipes on the side, may not all the way be in the quote unquote hardened criminal category, but they have to do what they have to do to make rent. When you put them in jail in this society, often for very, very long periods of time relative to other industrialized nations, you have a hardening effect many of the times, where some of these folks who would otherwise transition out of a criminal lifestyle would age out of it or find economic opportunity in the legitimate economy, they're in jail. So they can't do that in jail. When they get out, they have a record. If they happen to have a gun on them for self-defense, this is a cash economy. No, you can't go to anybody if they steal your drugs, and you still got to pay back your plug, the person who you owe money to, and you have to pay your rent. You need something to enforce that contract. So these folks aren't looking to they're not the drivers of murder in our community. They're not looking to actively hurt people and kill people, but for self-defense, they may have a weapon on them. And that produces these massively long jail sentences because almost all these drugs are illegal. So if you have any criminal record in this state, you can't get a legal gun. So you have folks who are not really shooters, not driving violence, but getting massive sentences for just carrying a gun for self-defense. And then they get out, they have very little opportunity in the traditional economy, so they come back traumatized oftentimes from a long jail bid. And they are in a more criminogenic state because of the trauma and because they have no access to the above ground economy. So this is what the war on drugs is actually doing in the empirical sense, but also in a social, psychological, spiritual sense. It's hollowing out the capacity of our community. It's producing waves of trauma, and it's producing the crime it's supposed to stop. So this isn't, I think, too controversial of analysis for most people in this crowd. Where I do think our unique perspective comes in, and some of the specifics of the research comes in, is what's the solution? So to switch gears, obviously with 2020, there's a racial justice awakening. There's massive investments in cities through things like the ARPA, American Rescue Funds. And even people like Joe Biden, noted drug warrior, is using words like harm reduction and public health-based approach to social problems. And many people are viewing that as a gateway to things like drug decriminalization and more progressive policies, and it's a net positive. So as part of our research agenda and part of our research series, based upon our perspective doing work in Baltimore, doing services, teaching debate for years, working in the political sphere, is that talking to service providers, talking to people on the ground, the reality of what some people call the nonprofit industrial complex. Some people view that argument only through the lens of exclusion, like you aren't giving Black and brown people money. You're not making them the head of foundations. That's not what I mean when I say that. I'm saying that the flip side of the prison industrial complex, as I stated before, in terms of violently controlling social dissent, is sucking in alternative, more radical possibilities into nonprofit infrastructure, which can themselves serve as another tool of surveillance, another tool of control, and another vector of violence. So it's the rise of the nonprofit public health response to addiction and so-called criminal justice issues that we're trying to head off and basically delineate the distinction between investing in nonprofits and reparations. And that's kind of what I want to talk about for the majority of the rest of the talk. So, addiction. We got to start with addiction because when people say decrim, they say, don't lock them up for it, send them to treatment. Joe Biden even loves to say, send them to mandatory treatment, one of his favorite catchphrases. This ignores the science that says many of the people who are using drugs are not actually, quote unquote, addicted. They're just using drugs. They're self-medicating, or maybe they just enjoy it. But the actual treatment infrastructure we have in America is largely for profit. Many of it is not, quote unquote, evidence-based, so I have issues with that term. But most of it comes out of Alcoholics Anonymous, this ideological movement that started in Ohio during the Great Depression with white evangelical theorists basically building an explicitly Christian theory of sin and redemption around addiction. You cannot actually be mandated to go to AA meetings in this country because they are deemed Christian, and it would be a separation of church and state issue. So the ideological foundation of NA, of residential rehabs, of a good chunk, not all, but a good chunk of the addiction industry, is white evangelical theory from the 1930s that says things like, you have to embrace your helplessness, you have to recognize how you failed, take personal responsibility, not putting it in a larger social political context, but personal responsibility for your own failure of addiction. And what that means from a racial justice context. So that goes to quote number 3. Quote number 3 is from basically the Bible of Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book. And this is a quote from a middle-aged Native American woman where she talks about her experience in AA. And I think it'll be kind of evident where I'm going with this, but let me read it. The AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, not African American, Alcoholics Anonymous woman, made sure I had no more alcohol in the house. She was very tough on me for a long time. I went to meetings every day and started taking the steps. The first step showed me that I was powerless over alcohol and anything else that threatened my sobriety or muddled my thinking. Alcohol was only a symptom of much deeper problems of dishonesty and denial. Now, it was a matter of coming to grips with a power greater than myself. That was very hard for me. How could all these white people even begin to think they can understand me? So they brought a sober Indian woman up to work with me for a day. That was a very powerful day. The Indian woman cut me no slack at all. I will never forget her. She convinced me that I was not unique. She said these white folks were the best thing that ever happened to me. Where would you be without them, she said. There are no alternatives. You got any better ideas for yourself? How many Indians do you know who are going to help you sober up? At the time, I couldn't think of any. I surrendered behind the tears of no answers and decided to do it all their way. I found the power greater in myself to be the magic above the heads of the people in the meetings. I chose to call that magic Great Spirit. So I think many people understand that this is potentially problematic, that you have a victim of colonization, seeing the conditions produced by colonization and alcoholism, and not blaming the structure of colonization, but blaming the people around them for their moral failures. Not seeing any possibility of redemption in them, but literally going to meetings with white people, seeing them as sober, and calling them the magic Great Spirit. And again, this is Alcoholics Anonymous' own book, what this is, right? And this is the ideological theory that's guiding a good chunk of our addiction industry. And the ramifications for African Americans, I think, are similarly dangerous when it comes to how an expansion of the treatment industry with these type of ideologies at their center would lead to ideological theories that would not be good from a liberation perspective, that would in fact lead people to pathologize their communities, to desire to leave their communities, and produce this ramification of harm and violence under the name of social justice and social investment. But this is kind of what I theorized. But as we did our interviews, we began to see some more instantiation of this theory, but also from a direct political economy perspective, talking about the addiction industry. So this is a quote from a middle-aged 50-something Black woman who works in addiction. There used to be a monthly meeting of resident providers to talk about changes in the field of residential housing and network with each other. Horrible abuses were happening there. I've seen firsthand horrible abuses in OP, outpatient, and IP, inpatient programs. Client trading, forgery of paperwork, inviting clients who didn't actually exist, creating whole cases from the ground up of people who don't exist so we can bill for them. Fraudulent audits, where you get teams of people that come in and create fake notes and fake clients to justify billing. The assumption is that's just how it is. These programs are big now. Built their foundations of institutions on fraudulence, navigating fraudulence, and learning how to navigate fraudulence, and teaching other people how to navigate fraudulence. They're also good-hearted programs. I've worked in recovery homes, drug court programs, inpatient, outpatient programs, medication management clinics, everywhere. Yeah, so I've seen some things. So most of treatment, from my experience, has been driven, of course, whatever outcome goals that the program has, and the outcome goals, usually the primary outcome is it may say it on paper, but usually it isn't this, of course, is the healing of the client or patient, that we want to see them go to this, and use to sober, and using to sober to recovery or maintenance. That's the underlying goal, but the truth of the matter is that it's driven by money. How much time is going to take for someone to move through our treatment protocols? So that way we can prove to the state that we are meeting their goals, that we can prove that we are deserving more money. The drive is, of course, more about how do we keep our jobs. So this is the unfortunate reality of most of these services that are being presented as the alternative to policing. It doesn't actually get into the actual political dynamics of many of these programs. Drug courts, for example. Drug courts are notoriously capricious and depending on the nature of the judge, but some people have found they actually increase prison sentences. How is that possible? This is supposed to be an alternative court for addicted offenders who are experiencing addiction to basically get out of jail, contingent upon staying sober, seeking employment, and going to meetings. But what people have found is that the requirements are so onerous with drug courts, and one violation with many judges means you have to serve your entire sentence. When previously you would go to jail for a possession offense, maybe for 2 or 3 years, but only serve 9 months of it. So when you have a drug court that's making you do all 3 years because you pissed hot for weed, that's actually increasing a net increase in time you spent in jail. And it doesn't even deal with the paternalism, the being cursed out in drug courts, the being lectured to, for doing things that, again, of course, many people have the freedom to do because they're not under the thumb of the police state. Similarly with addiction, if you're in mandatory addiction care, you're basically still in jail. Because even if you don't piss hot, even if you break any law, not law, but rule in the addiction facility, they can just send you back to jail. And the stories, the horror stories, and again, some places are good and well-meaning, but the AA ideology and the power differential leads to many horror stories in mandatory inpatient care. There was an example, one book where basically a woman got pregnant, came to care, and it's like, well, you need to get serious about your sobriety. And you can't be serious about your sobriety if you had this kid. So basically get an abortion or we send you to jail. And this is the reality of the system that's being presented as an alternative to police incarceration, as the social justice alternative that Decrim would rely upon, right? But to kind of bring it to Maryland and kind of get back to LBS's work as we begin to wrap up. So Maryland, of course, is going to be voting, many people already have voted on cannabis legalization. And as you can see, there's this argument that this is part of a larger trajectory of decriminalization, that's part of a larger social justice movement. But academic analysis and also our work, we do a lot of advocacy in the state capital of Annapolis, has proven this is not quite what it appears to be. So this is a quote from Stephen Bender. He writes in this article, The Color of Cannabis, quote, "Anecdotally, a Washington advocate for marijuana legalization told me that racial profiling arguments won't win legalization campaigns and instead will alienate voters. Frustration with cartels of color controlling drug production and distribution was evident not just in those upset over the profiteering from illicit drugs, but in the perception that cartels pay no attention to product safety and that government is better suited to ensure an unadulterated product. White entrepreneurs dominate the legal cannabis market, and so voters may have been making the choice between that perception of shady cartels of color controlling the illicit markets and of more trusted white business owners and local governments profiting from marijuana consumption. So this argument that white business people are going to dominate cannabis and that we're going to continue to criminalize illicit cannabis post-legalization, that's not a bug in the legalization system. That's a feature of many of the forms of legalization argumentation that many mainstream cannabis nonprofits have been using for years to, quote, just get the darn bill passed. Because the theory is that, well, even though we know that the black people selling weed on the streets of Baltimore are the same as the white people who sold it on the streets of California, or really in their homes in California in the 80s and 90s, and then transitioned to become millionaires in the legal market, they're doing the same thing. But we can use the idea of these dangerous cartels to continue to push legalization over the finish line. And so when you push the cartel narrative, that doesn't really humanize the person on the street selling drugs. It makes them look like a criminal, which was supposed to be the opposite of what legalization was supposed to do. And in fact, in California, and California is unique, they have massively cheap cannabis in the illicit market because it grows so well out there. They have such a cannabis culture. They've been adamant about increasing enforcement on illicit cannabis sales, more so post-legalization. Because think about it, post-legalization, you have two powerful forces combining to attack illicit cannabis sales. You have the legal cannabis businesses, who of course are going to say what? Eating into my profits. But you also have who? State government, because they want the tax revenue that only comes from legal sales. So you're facing a real reality that's already happening in California, where you're going to have increased focus on criminalizing people with intent to distribute, even if you decriminalize and legalize possession. This is, again, countering the narrative that merely decriminalization is a vector of social justice advocacy. And similarly, the idea that illegal cannabis sales drive violence. It's not to say that there's no violence that comes from the illicit cannabis market, but it is to say that the narrative that all violence is somehow tied to selling drugs is being used in Maryland right now to maintain the ability to search someone's car based upon the smell of cannabis. So you can't, so a state Supreme Court ruling says you can't stop someone when they're walking on the street if you smell cannabis. Anything you find won't be legally admissible in terms of the courts. But the police unions have been adamant about preserving the smell of cannabis as a pretext stop, not just to pull somebody over, because I get that, they could be driving intoxicated, but not just to pull people over for driving while intoxicated, but to search their car. And because they want the smell of cannabis to be a pretext for looking for guns. So we have all of this being wrapped into a so-called social justice-driven legalization campaign here in Maryland. And I think that is similarly what has produced a lot of the skepticism that decriminalization in general for opioids, while it could deal some with the overdose dynamic, what it actually produced the forms of social justice to deal with this legacy of violence, where they deal with the nature of the nonprofit industrial complex using this increased funding to further their hegemony in these spaces. And again, our research shows that there's not much belief in the grassroots communities of Baltimore that would be the case. So, kind of wanting to leave time for Q&A here. I do want to kind of push towards conclusions, and I want to start with the conclusion around what exactly is the difference between just investing in nonprofits and actual reparations. So to kind of briefly bring in some critical race theory, even though I'm sure that the university will say, well, we don't teach critical race theory, but you know, it's fine. Derek Bell is the so-called father, one of the fathers of critical race theory. He has a theory of interest convergence, that progress, particularly for Black people in America, as a former civil rights attorney who worked on some of the school desegregation cases, he basically argued that the U.S. is more interested in the symbol of desegregation than actually enforcing integration. And you can notice that by when Brown v. Board happened. Brown v. Board did not happen in the tumult of the 60s. Brown v. Board happened in 54. What else was happening in 54? Korean War just ended. Korean War, first time integrated troops fought in the same units. So you had a bunch of Black men with guns having a taste of freedom, but you also have massive decolonization campaigns happening worldwide. And decolonization is seen as just this general flourishing of human freedom. And the reality is decolonization is an economic battle between which sphere of influence is going to dominate the economies of these decolonizing nations, between the Soviet Union and America. Because when you're a colony, you trade with the colonial metropole. If you're a French colony, you got to trade with France. British. When you kick the British out, now America or Soviet Union can get access to those markets. So the idea that America wants to trade with these nations, it's really hard when they look at America and they say, well, you're treating Black folks really badly in the South. We don't trust you're going to treat us well. So if it's an ethereal theory of general academic theory, it's billions of dollars at stake for the image of America when it comes to things like the image of segregation and the symbol of Brown v. Board versus actually enforcing integration. So we don't actually integrate most of the schools. Some Black elites get sent to some nice white schools. Some Black folks generally get sent to pretty poor, lower quality white schools. But we totally fail to integrate all the Black teachers, as an entire generations of Black teaching corps who are not brought into the white schools. So we lose this entire generation of some of the most stalwart leaders of our Black community, this Black teaching corps, all in the name of integration. So this idea of interest convergence, I think, is really essential to understand why investment itself is not reparations. Because when the investment flows through the dynamics of interest convergence, you have everything that we've talked about today. You have institutional nonprofits being able to use Black people's desires to take care of our community, to love on each other, and almost weaponize that against them. Where the only way for us to do the work to keep our people alive is through the institutional apparatuses they control. Professor Joy James calls this captive maternals, where our desire to, in an ungendered term, mother each other, take care of the Black community, means that dominant white institutions get to survive off the unpaid labor that we do in those institutions that are themselves causing so much of the violence, right? So the idea is being presented. Reparations have traditionally been a narrative of Black autonomy. It comes out of a recognition of the dominant part of reparations is repair. Repair means there must have been something there before the violence happened, and the goal of reparations should be restore what was there before. This is very difficult in the concept of America's thinking about African American people, because the theory is Black people had nothing. They were just slaves. And the reality of the societal institutions we build to reproduce our culture, to meet our economic and social needs, those things are not part of the dominant American thinking about people of African descent. It's that the only way we have ever survived in the larger American white liberal imagination is attaching ourselves to white institutions. So a narrative that has been dominated and produced by the Black Pan-African nationalist, Black independence part of the Black liberation struggle is now essentially being interest converged, if you will, into this theory of reparations as we have to repair the relationship between Black people and white people by integrating more Black people into white institutions. Our definition of reparations is the exact opposite. If you have to restore the capacity of indigenous institutions in the Black community to be able to meet the needs of that community so they don't have to rely on the noblesse oblige or the good graces of white institutions for their very survival. So I know we're on short on time, but just one example of this is during the pandemic, there were billions of dollars circulated into food banks. And food banks basically serve as a backstop to people's fear that capitalism will produce starvation. And very understandably, and this is definitely something that's very useful, but from the perspective of reparations, we're still dependent upon food banks and the charity of the food banks for literally our ability to eat. And what we propose as an alternative is think about what if those billions of dollars had actually been invested in community-controlled agriculture of food production and food sovereignty, where it's not just growing food in your backyard. There's something called the Black Church Food Security Network, where Black churches, who oftentimes own quite a bit of land and have direct connections to the communities that are most in need of nourishment, are increasingly using their land to grow produce, healthy produce, to keep their parishioners alive and feed them nutritious foods. And not just that, they also have connections to Black farmers throughout the Eastern Shore, all over the country, throughout the South, who in aggregate actually have a substantial ability of agricultural capacity to feed our community. What had happened if we had put that billions of dollars that we spend on food banks into investing in an apparatus of food sovereignty for African people? You may have less calories coming out the door initially, like literally I can count the calories in a jar of peanut butter. So within the Eurocentric evidence-based mindset, it may not appear to be an effective solution, but from a reparations perspective, the problem is not the lack of peanut butter. The problem is the lack of power. an institutional capacity to meet our own needs. So this is a fundamental distinction between the investment mindset and the reparations mindset. Well, the reparations mindset mandates that the people who are aggrieved by the harm have to have the power to choose for themselves the mechanism of redress for that harm. This is oftentimes the opposite of what happens in the nonprofit investment mindset, where we use frames like evidence-based. Evidence-based is an inherently conservative framework for investment. It means we already have to have had someone do the thing that we're trying to do in order for us to do it. And this quote, and one of the last quotes I want to read today, kind of shows some of the limitations of that mindset and some of the dynamics I want to demonstrate here. So this is a Black elder who has worked in African civil rights of passage and has this commentary about the nonprofit infrastructure and some of the dynamics there within. So he writes, quote, "That's what rites of passage was about. Teach children, the young people and their parents, a value system based upon the Nguzo Anani, part of the Nguzo Saba, which is some of the tenets of Kwanzaa. And we had a few hundred youth over the years, and we did a lot to help them and help their parents. I remember times we would get a call from one of the youth parents. I don't know where he is. He didn't come home. Well, we had great success in terms of, because we paid pretty specific attention to the children and tried to work with them rather than punish them. We moved to teach other men how to do rites of passage. That was our thrust. It's been the last 25 years. So we know the methodology works and we have proof. However, we don't have research studies. We haven't done that kind of stuff to get you political funding. And it's, it's because we can affect that some people who created the torture basically want to fund our recovery. And that's where the idea of reparations comes from. And I'll say reparations for those people who have the courage of cultural integrity. With rights, we weren't looking for funding because we knew that we're not going to fund something that was going to force them to change their way. The system. Once you subsidize, you regulate. And that's how I look at grants and going for government funded programs. Okay, we're going to give you this money, but you better not do this. You better not do that, and you better not do these things, you see? So I don't want to take a subsidy from somebody who wants to regulate me, and we may disagree on what the goal is. We became people who they relied upon. Baba, I'm sick. They come up and you feel their head and they have a temperature and that type of thing. Because they weren't getting care, you see in the African American community, especially the women, some of the women have really fallen victim to crack. And that's terrible because the kids we knew, their mother was on crack. And she would try to pull herself together and she would come around to see us. But then we see that and the young kids weren't getting appropriate care and the father, he was likely in jail. And that was very important to me to develop a worldview where Black people have works, where Black people have a history because we're told we have no history. And that's one of the things that came out of the Black Power movement with Black consciousness and being able to say we do have a history. And history says we can't allow ourselves to be fooled and get caught up in drugs. In the African culture, you're expected to be your own police. Your family has an interest in you not becoming a social pariah. So I think this kind of speaks to how the cycles of white liberalism kind of compound themselves. Because what you have is disinvestment, mass incarceration. Black people then build organic responses to that disinvestment in the face of mass incarceration. Things like the programs Baba is talking about, these rites of passage programs. So when white folks come back in, they say the political instability of our chronic disinvestment is now becoming an economic danger to us. You can't gentrify Baltimore if Baltimore has over 300 murders a year. So it's not a desire to care about Black people's lives that's driving this new frame of investment. It's recognizing that the failure of the previous mass incarceration is causing social instability that's impacting profits. Again, interest convergence. So when that interest convergence is the dominant mechanism, you basically, again, you say we want to invest. But we want to invest in evidence-based programming. So show us your research. Show us 3 years of audited statements, audited financial statements. Show me you have a 501c3. Show me that you are respectable and that I can invest my money in you. And not only are you going to be able to prove you spent it on what I want you to spend it on, but that you have things like a nonprofit board that's usually filled with rich people that are in my social networks, that if you ever step out of line, I can lean on your board and control you. So these are some of the dynamics of why investment itself can't be reparations. Because reparations will focus on things like capacity building for grassroots Black institutions. Reparations will focus on things like putting money in the hands of community themselves to choose who they want to fund. Because programs like the one Baba is talking about have incredible community support. But they not only do they lack support in the liberal nonprofit industrial complex, they've oftentimes been shunned by many of the funders and dominant players. The same people who are now leading the push for decrim are some of the people who have ostracized and attacked some of the Black elders, like the person who this quote comes from, because the Black elder criticizes their programming, criticizes their liberal noblesse oblige, criticizes that inability to actually foster independence in the Black community. And so we're stuck in a captive maternal, looking to the very institutions that ostracize people like the speaker to do things like fund decrim. Right, so again, just kind of wrap up, I'm running short on time here, but some of the, actually, I'll skip the last quote. So some of the takeaways, some of the things that we have to do. We need to recognize that public health can be part of the solution, and liberal academia and foundations can be part of the solution, but they cannot lead decrim or any other real, genuine reparations work. Things like overdose prevention fit well within the public health mindset. But it's almost like the drunk looking for their keys under the light post. What we know how to do is reverse overdoses caused by opioid and opiate intoxication. So things like naloxone, safe consumption sites. What we don't know how to do is intervene in a larger cycle of addiction, the larger patterns of not just drug addiction, not just opioid addiction, but also crack addiction, still the same, also gaming addiction, also sex addiction. The forms of addiction that come up through the larger dislocation of people's economic future, sense of purposeless and meaninglessness, public health, medicalized public health has no answer for that. So when they talk about decrim, they only talk about medicalized interventions into addiction, which I think are in theory good. The infrastructure they run through may not be great, but they can't do the larger social, spiritual work that's going to get people like the speaker in the last quote to actually support that program. Because he's been so ostracized, he's now jaded. He's now withdrawn from many of these networks, and that exacerbates division that we have no Black people to fund. There's nothing there to invest in. Because the cumulative impact of the liberal attacks on people like the speaker produce their withdrawal from the political sphere. It's actually the same thing that Dr. Clear said the mass incarceration did. It causes them to have this sort of oppositional defiance and reject the engagement in politics that would be necessary for us to create these solutions. So you have to actively engage in the community because, as the speaker says, Black folks have complex feelings about drug use. We have been told that we are irrational people, that we are led by our lust, we are led by our hedonism. So the idea of embracing Black people using drugs is not inherently liberatory for people who've been given that constellation of societal stereotypes. That may not be the same thing for a white kid on college campuses, who also may have more freedom to explore without that social historical baggage. Similarly, if you're white and you're intoxicated, cop may put you in the van and drop you off at the campus clinic. If you're Black and intoxicated, you can get shot, right? If you're Black and intoxicated, your family can get kicked off of food stamps. Your family can get kicked out of public housing. So this idea of drug use within that liberal individualist celebration of exploration and pleasure, not that those things are inherently wrong, but Black folks need to have a much more complicated relationship to drugs than that dominant narrative of liberal, libertarian drug policy advocacy has been able to encapsulate. And we're not going to accept top-down interventions into these dynamics. They had to be bottom-up, organic from the Black experience. So to conclude, LBS is working on, we've already passed 30% of all tax revenue from the state's legalization of cannabis will go into the Community Restoration Fund. And that money will go to localities for the people at a local level to decide what they want to spend that money on. Because we realized other states were having so much of the money tied up in the state capital, that was basically making it very difficult for the community to control that money and led to the nonprofit industrial complex controlling most of those funds. So we want to send it to a local level where you have more of a possibility of community control over those funds so they can actually invest in the neighborhoods that have been most impacted by mass incarceration. And they can actually invest in programs like the one done by Baba, the previous speaker, that have community support. Similarly, next session, there's going to be big battles over ensuring that possession with intent to distribute is not a criminal offense, and that the smell of cannabis is not a pretextual stop for people to search your car. Because again, you're not catching the shooters who do this, you're catching the people who have to have a gun to protect themselves. The shooters have incredible lawyers, and our cops are so incompetent, they can't really make good cases against them. So they lean on these mandatory minimums, they lean on these pretextual searches because they can't make good cases against the people who are actually driving violence in our community. And what we're producing is more of that conveyor belt that Michael Mueller-Smith is talking about. So again, LBS is working on these conditions here in Maryland. Thank you for having me, and we have a little bit of time left for Q&A.
so much. I'm actually going to stop sharing. Yeah. So it looks like we have a few people online. Feel free. Oops. I see we have a few people online still. Feel free to ask questions here in person or online for Lawrence. We've got about maybe 9 more minutes. Is there a question in the chat?
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, just wanted to put the chat up. Not that. Go. I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
How do you personally stay motivated? This seems very heavy, very not burdensome, but it's a lot, right?
Yeah.
How do you personally stay motivated to continue this work?
I mean, that's something that everyone struggles with. I think that when you frame it through the lens of global national politics, it's very easy to feel discouraged. But I think I've been part of a community that actually has been able to really claim some very concrete victories that oftentimes don't get talked about in the mainstream media. So after the uprising, there was an effort led by then Council President Jack Young to put a section of Baltimore City's property tax in the fund for programming for youth. Mm-hmm. And basically, from our perspective, we were like, we support that, but we're not going to allow the nonprofit industrial complex to dictate where that money goes. So for the past 6, 7 years, we've actually been part of an advocacy effort and then brought on as consultants to design and support the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. So this is a $10 million yearly rotating fund that funds programming for youth, and they've done an excellent job focusing on capacity building, working with people who don't have C3s, and doing everything that I think is a template for the Cannabis Restoration Fund, right? And so the problem is that if the people in community can make decisions about where this money goes, why do I even need a foundation? This is a threat to the jobs and livelihoods of the people in the nonprofit sector. And it's also a threat to that hegemony of expertise. People make their money consulting, saying, I know how to put money on the ground in a way that makes a difference. If the community can do that themselves, then why do I have to consult with you? I just talk to them. So the unfortunate reality is, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it, you don't hear about the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund because if it is successful, it is a threat to the dominant system of nonprofit infrastructure here in the state of Maryland, and really throughout the country. But I know the work they're doing. I know about Conscious Kids Barbershop that was able to fund apprentices through the Children and Youth Fund, where they never been able to do that before. I know about programs like Revolutionary Summer, where Black women get together to learn about political heroes and sheroes of their collective history. So being able to plug into that history of empirical work, again, the work around police accountability, people told us we would never stop the youth jail. People told us we would never repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. Now, there's interest convergence and all that. But it's our advocacy that forces that interest to converge. And we're able to continuously to push for more liberatory forms of enforcement after the interest convergence kicks in. I didn't repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights after Freddie Gray. He did after George Floyd. So interest convergence is a real thing. But by being consistent, we're able to apply this pressure. So I have actually a question from the chat. You want me to read it? I am a history grad student who plans to pursue a PhD while focusing on the history of Black freedom struggle in this global context. In light of this, would you be able to further specify any of your ideas on how academic historians of the Black freedom struggle can be an ally to those who are leading this struggle? Thank you. That's an excellent question. So the Black freedom struggle is large, heterogeneous, and complex. We pull from theorists who are oftentimes marginalized in the academy. Theorists who adopt the Black Power framework, not just as a stylistic rhetorical affectation, but as a political theory. So we're looking at people like formerly Donna Richards, who is now with Marimba Ani, who used to be a member of SNCC. She became a professor. She wrote a book, Yurugu, basically a political theory of Eurocentric thought. Things like that serve as an academic foundation, so incorporating people like Marimba Ani into your analysis, but also looking at the work of Black Power not as a stylistic affectation, but as a political movement. So if you look at something like the Black Power Convention in Gary, the person who led the convention was Mary Baraka. Mary Baraka is a poet. It's like, why is a poet leading that convention? That's just more of Black Power being obsessed with style over substance. You would think that, because that's part of the caricatures of Black nationalism and Pan-African nationalism, which we talk about on our podcast, In Search of Black Power, so feel free to look at that too. But Amiri Baraka was leading a political movement in Newark that was putting Black elected officials in office and leading economic development on the ground to the tune of millions of dollars. And people don't study that part of what he was doing because they want to take him as the guy who wrote The Dutchman, these plays and these poems. And of course, there are limitations, and of course, there are historical deviations, but to study those things empirically, study the Perrin Mitchell, study the Congressional Black Caucus, study the efforts to put minority set-asides into mandatory expenditures for federal construction contracts. Things like that are, I think, material instantiations of this Black power thrust that employed hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people over the years. We don't study it because, unfortunately, there's this notion that people who adopt this framework of Black independent political activity, they're speaking out of like trauma, emotionality. There are these caricatures overcoded in independent Black political thought that make it impossible to believe they actually are making material efforts on the ground that are productive. Again, because how would you know if there is no incentive to cover them? If the political progress they make is a threat to people who have an alternative political perspective, right? So you definitely want to plug yourself into academics who have a concrete history of these movements, people like Harold Cruz, former professor at University of Michigan. He wrote 2 books, Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, but also Plural But Equal. Plural But Equal was a fantastic book he wrote in the 80s about his critique of the NAACP, similar to Derek Bell's critique of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the work they did with Brown. But the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is very popular. So the people that critique them don't have the same cachet as the people who support them. But this is part of what it means to love Black people enough to study them seriously. So you don't just look at the people who have academic clout, but also just look empirically and structurally at what we need and being able to take on the burden of studying them and coming to answers, even if they're inconvenient. Again, it's like, I think all of us in this work, none of us really come to it from a Black liberation perspective in our houses. My father was a cop. My father did undercover narcotics work in Baltimore City. So I had to come to these perspectives over time, studying the issues of my community, seeing the empirical reality and figuring out what worked. And I think it's just being willing to go on that journey, even if the places you might find yourself may not be popular, may not be convenient, but can lead to you actually finding answers that are productive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, so thank you. You can check us out on lbsbaltimore.com, LBS Baltimore on Facebook, on Instagram. We actually have an election night watch party coming out next week. So at Remix downtown Baltimore on election night Tuesday, we're going to be having a party talking about the election results. We also have our Black Legislative Agenda Day, where we talk about the work we're doing next legislative session. That's going to be, I believe, second week in December. You can find all this on our website. You can follow me, Lawrence Grandpre, at on Facebook, Lawrence Grandpre, but also on Twitter at Neo-Nubian. That's N-E, the number 0. Nubian, N-U-B-I-A-N. You can find In Search of Black Power, our podcast. We just dropped an episode today about what I just talked about, the caricatures of Pan-African nationalism and Black nationalism. You can find that anywhere you get podcasts. So I appreciate you all, and hopefully you all will plug into the work we're doing in Annapolis, here in Maryland, because again, it can be very easy to fall into pessimism if you look at politics in that national frame. We're making real headway here in Maryland, but you really have to plug into the movements to see the headway and feel the progress, because you're not going to get that through social media. So hopefully we can see you all when you come out, and hopefully, again, be sure to be involved in Annapolis, because that's where so much of the money and the power flows in the state. And you can have a disproportionate impact in Annapolis because so few people pay attention to it. And there's so much you can do leaning on your state representative, your state senator, when it comes to ensuring the money for cannabis legalization goes to the community, when it comes to pushing back against the attempts to recriminalize the Black market or the legacy economy around cannabis. There's so much work to be done locally. It is difficult because we're coming out of a pandemic, and it feels hard to talk to your neighbors about politics and to get into disagreements. That's where a lot of the progress is going to be made. It's being willing to work through that sense of insecurity, that sense of discomfort to really meet political demands and cause real political change. So hopefully we'll see you in Annapolis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Yay.